Number 1. A Christmas of Long Ago by Lucy Maud Montgomery. "Hurrah!" cried Ted jubilantly. "Christmas will be here in a week. I wish it came every month." "Christmas will be extra nice this year because Grandma is with us," said Alice, with a loving glance at the old lady with the silvery hair and bright brown eyes who was knitting by the fire. Grandma smiled. "This will be only the second Christmas of my life that I have spent away from my own home," she said. "The first one was 60 years ago, children, when I was a little girl of 10 and went with my 3 brothers to spend Christmas with our grandfather and grandmother. We had a delightful drive, but it was a very different Christmas from your Christmas of today. We did not have your dozens of beautiful and expensive presents, nor your wonderful trees and decorations. Still, we thought our Christmas at Grandfather's just about right." "Tell us about it," pleaded the children, who loved to hear Grandma talk of those faraway years when she was a little girl. "When I came here last week, I came on the train," said Grandma, "but in those days there were no railroads near where we lived, and we drove the 30 miles to Grandfather's the day before Christmas. It was cold and frosty, and there was plenty of snow. Mother wrapped us all up warmly in shawls and homespun caps and mufflers, and we did not mind the cold. We went on what was called a wood sleigh, just boards on runners. Father had put some straw on it, and Mother had spread a big rug over it. We all sat close together on this, and when the sloughs or the pitches were very bad, we clung to the upright stakes in the corners or the jingling iron chains that connected them. When we got to Grandfather's at twilight and trooped into the kitchen, such a fire as they had for us! You never see such fires nowadays. There was a big open fireplace taking up most of one end of the room, with just snug corners on each side of it. Grandfather had heaped it with great hickory logs, and they were blazing with delightful fierceness, sending a rosy glow out on our faces, and lighting up the whole of the old-fashioned room with its low ceiling and long black rafters, from which hung festoons of dried apples and Grandmother's assortment of herbs. Grandfather had tacked green boughs all around the room in honor of the season. At home, we thought ourselves very modern because we had stoves, but we loved that splendid fireplace of Grandfather's. Such a pleasant evening as we had, all sitting about it, uncles, aunts, and cousins, not needing even candlelight. The older folks told stories, and we children listened open-eyed, while we munched apples and cracked peach nuts. Our dreams that night were haunted by Indians and bears galore. We did not have Christmas trees then. We had not even heard of them. Before we went to bed, Grandmother took our stockings and hung them along the chimney-piece in a dangling row. We had never hung up our stockings at home, for how could Santa Claus come down a stovepipe and through a stove? But we were sure he could come down that splendid big chimney easy enough. In the morning our stockings were full when we all came trooping into the kitchen. I don't know what you would have thought of our presents, but we were delighted with them. There was not a bought present among them. All were homemade. I got a pair of red mittens knitted in a fancy pattern such as Aunt Emmy could knit, a scarf of shaded wool and blues knitted in Grandmother's famous checkerboard pattern, a big rag doll dressed in a piece of Aunt Ada's wedding dress, a white muslin apron with 6 bows on the shoulders, and a bag of homemade candy. I remember there was a sled for each of the boys, and one of the elderwood whistles for the making of which Grandfather was celebrated. I believed in Santa Claus wholeheartedly, and I begged Grandfather to tell me if he had shown Santa how to make the whistles. I thought Mrs. Santa Claus must have known the fancy stripe and checkerboard pattern. The other children went to church with the grown-ups, for there was always service on Christmas morning then. I stayed home to help Grandmother with the dinner, for I was the oldest girl. I have never forgotten that big pantry with the stores of good things she had prepared, and the plum pudding, cooked a fortnight beforehand, and bigger than I had ever thought a plum pudding could be. We set the table in the kitchen, and as a special privilege I was allowed to place thereon the dishes of the set that had been part of Grandmother's wedding plenishings. They were a handsome dark blue, and not a piece had been broken in 40 years. We did not have any elaborate decorations, none at all, indeed, except the two big dishes full of red apples, polished until they shone. But there was really no room for decorations. The good things to eat occupied all the available space. What delectable odors filled that big kitchen when the hungry guests came home from church. My brother Tom declared he smelt the roast goose 4 miles down the road. Everybody had good appetites and did full justice to Grandmother's Christmas cheer. We all sat around the table until late in the afternoon, talking, laughing, and telling stories. Finally, we girls helped Grandmother wash the dishes, and then it was time to go home through the crisp, waning December afternoon, and Christmas at Grandfather's was over, to be talked of and remembered vividly all through the winter. That was the nicest Christmas I ever spent, dearie. "It sounds jolly," said Ted. "I wish we could have Christmases like that now." Grandma smiled. "You have just as good Christmases, although in a different way. You would have thought that celebration very simple and quiet, I'm afraid. But remember, dearie, it's the spirit of Christmas that counts. It must be a spirit of goodwill and kindness and joy and love. We must never forget the real meaning of Christmas, never let it be dimmed by any false meanings, and then our Christmases will always be happy and blessed and long to be remembered, no matter where or how they are celebrated." "Oh, that is true," said Alice soberly. "We'll all try to make our Christmas the right kind, Grandma." "But I do wish we had a big fireplace," said Ted. End of A Christmas Long Ago by Lucy Maud Montgomery. It was a Christmas Eve service in the Second Westcock Church. The church at Second Westcock was quaint and old-fashioned, like the village over which it presided. Its shingles were gray with the beating of many winters. Its little square tower was surmounted by 4 spindling posts, like the legs of a table turned heavenward. Its staring windows were adorned with curtains of yellow cotton. Its uneven and desolate churchyard, strewn with graves and snowdrifts, occupied a bleak hillside looking out across the bay to the lonely height of Sheppity Mountain. Down the long slope below the church straggled the village, half lost in the snow, and whistled over by the winds of the Bay of Fundy. Second Westcott was an outlying corner of the rector's expansive parish, and a Christmas Eve service there was an event almost unparalleled. To give Second Westcock this service, the rector had forsaken his prosperous congregations at Westcock, Sackville, and Dorchester, driving some 8 or 10 miles through the snows and solitude of the deep Dorchester woods. And because the choir at Second Westcott was not remarkable, even for willingness, much less for strength or skill, he had brought with him his 15-year-old niece, Lou Allison, to swell the Christmas praises with the notes of her clarionet. The little church was lighted with oil lamps ranged along the white wall between the windows. The poor, bare chancel, a red cloth-covered kitchen table in a semicircle of paintless railing, was flanked by 2 towering pulpits of white pine. On either side the narrow carpetless aisle were rows of painted benches. On the left were gathered solemnly the men of the congregation, each looking straight ahead. On the right were the women, whispering and scanning each other's bonnets, till the appearance of the rector from the little vestry room by the door should bring silence and reverent attention. In front of the women's row stood the melodeon, and the 2 benches behind it were occupied by the choir, the male members of which sat blushingly self-conscious, proud of their office, but deeply abashed at the necessity of sitting among the women. There was no attempt at Christmas decoration, for Second Westcock had never been awakened to the delicious excitements of the church greening. At last the rector appeared in his voluminous white surplice. He moved slowly up the aisle and mounted the winding steps of the right-hand pulpit, and as he did so his 5-year-old son, forsaking his place by Lou's side, marched forward and seated himself resolutely on the pulpit steps. He did not feel quite at home in Second Westcock Church. The sweet old carol, "While shepherds watch their flocks by night," rose rather doubtfully from the little choir, who looked and listened askance at the glittering clarionet into which Lou was now blowing softly. Lou was afraid to make herself distinctly heard at first, lest she should startle the singers. But in the second verse the pure, vibrant notes came out with confidence, and then for 2 lines the song was little more than a duet between Lou and the rector's vigorous baritone. In the third verse, however, it all came right. The choir felt and responded to the strong support and thrilling stimulus of the instrument, and at length ceased to dread their own voices. The naked little church was glorified with the sweep of triumphal song pulsating through it. Never before had such music been heard there. Men, women, and children sang from their very souls, and when the hymn was ended, the whole congregation stood for some seconds, as in a dream, with quivering throats, till the rector's calm voice, repeating the opening words of the liturgy, brought back their self-control in some measure. Thereafter every hymn and chant and carol was like an inspiration, and Lou's eyes sparkled with exultation. When the service was over, the people gathered round the stove by the door, praising Lou's clarionet and petting little Ted, who had by this time come down from the pulpit steps. One old lady gave the child 2 or 3 brown sugar biscuits, which she had brought in her pocket, and a pair of red mittens, which she had knitted for him as a Christmas present. Turning to Lou, the old lady said, "I never heard nothing like that trumpet of yourn, miss. I felt like it just drawed down the angels from heaven to sing with us tonight. Their voices was all swimming in a smoke like right up the hollow of the ceiling." "'Tain't a trumpet," interrupted Teddy shyly. "It's a clarinet. I got a trumpet at home." "To be sure," replied the old lady indulgently. "Well, miss, as I was a-saying, that music of yourn could just soften the hardest hearts as ever was." The rector had just come from the vestry room, well wrapped up in his furs, and was shaking hands and wishing everyone a Merry Christmas, while the sexton brought the horse to the door. He overheard the old lady's last remark as she was bundling Teddy up in a huge woolen muffler. "It certainly did," said he, "make the singing go magnificently tonight, didn't it, Mrs. Tate? But I wonder now what sort of an effect it would produce on a hard-hearted bear if such a creature should come out at us while we were going through Dorchester woods." The mild pleasantry was very delicately adapted to the rector's audience, and the group about the stove smiled with a reverent air befitting the place they were in. But the old lady exclaimed in haste, "My land's sake, parson, I better be just scared to death." "I wonder if it would frighten a bear," thought Lou to herself, as they were getting snugly bundled into the warm, deep pung, as the low box sleigh with movable seats is called. Soon the crest of the hill was passed, and the 4-poster on the top of 2nd Westcott Church sank out of sight. For a mile or more the road led through half-cleared pasture lands, where the black stumps stuck up so strangely through the drifts that Teddy discovered bears on every hand. He was not at all alarmed, however, for he was sure his father was a match for 1,000 bears. By and by the road entered the curious inverted dark of the Dorchester woods, where all the light seemed to come from the white snow under the trees rather than from the dark sky above them. At this stage of the journey, Teddy retired beneath the buffalo robes and went to sleep in the bottom of the pung. The horse jogged slowly along the somewhat heavy road. The bells jingled drowsily amid the soft, pulsing whisper of the runners. Lou and the rector talked in quiet voices, attuned to the solemn hush of the great forest. "What's that?" Lou shivered up closer to the rector as she spoke and glanced nervously into the dark woods whence the sound had come. He did not answer at once, but seized the whip and tightened the reins as a signal to old Jerry to move on faster. The horse needed no signal, but awoke into an eager trot, which would have become a gallop had the rector permitted. Again came the sound, this time a little nearer, and still, apparently, just abreast of the pung, but deep in the woods. It was a bitter, long, wailing cry, blended with a harshly grating undertone, like the rasping of a saw. "What is it?" asked Lou, her teeth chattering. The rector let old Jerry out into a gallop as he answered, "I'm afraid it's a panther, what they call around here an Indian devil. But I don't think there's any real danger. It is a ferocious beast, but will probably give us a wide berth." "Why won't it attack us?" asked Lou. "Oh, it prefers solitary victims," replied the rector. "It is ordinarily a cautious beast and does not understand the combination of man and horse and vehicle. Only on rare occasions has it been known to attack people driving, and this one will probably keep well out of our sight. However, it's just as well to get beyond its neighborhood as quickly as possible. Steady, Jerry, old boy, steady! Don't use yourself up too fast." The rector kept the horse well in hand, but in a short time it was plain that the panther was not avoiding the party. The cries came nearer and nearer, and Lou's breath came quicker and quicker, and the rector's teeth began to set themselves grimly, while his brows gathered in anxious thought. If it should come to a struggle, what was there in the sleigh, he was wondering, that would serve as a weapon? Nothing, absolutely nothing, but his heavy pocket-knife. A poor weapon, thought he ruefully, with which to fight a panther. But he felt in his pocket with one hand and opened the knife and slipped it under the edge of the cushion beside him. At this instant he caught sight of the panther bounding along through the low underbrush, keeping parallel with the road and not 40 yards away. "There it is!" came in a terrified whisper from Lou's lips, and just then Teddy lifted his head from under the robes. Frightened at the speed and at the set look on his father's face, he began to cry. The panther heard him and turned at once toward the sleigh. Old Jerry stretched himself out in a burst of extra speed, while the rector grasped his poor knife fiercely, and the panther came with a long leap right into the road, not 10 paces behind the flying sleigh. Teddy stared in amazement, then cowered down in fresh terror as there came an ear-splitting screech, wild and high and long, from Lou's clarionet. Lou had turned, and over the back of the seat was blowing this peal of desperate defiance in the brute's very face. The astonished animal shrank back in his tracks and sprang again into the underbrush. Lou turned to the rector with a flushed face of triumph, and the rector exclaimed in a husky voice, "Thank God!" But Teddy, between his sobs, complained, "What'd you do that for, Lou?" Lou jumped to the conclusion that her victory was complete and final, but the rector kept Jerry at his top speed and scrutinized the underwood apprehensively. The panther appeared again in 4 or 5 minutes, returning to the road and leaping along some 40 or 50 feet behind the sleigh. His pace was a very curious, disjointed, india-rubbery spring, which rapidly closed up on the fugitives. Then round swung Lou's long instrument again, and at its piercing cry the animal again shrank back. This time, however, he kept to the road, and the moment Lou paused for breath, he resumed the chase. "Save your breath, child," exclaimed the rector, as Lou again put the slender tube to her lips. "Save your breath, and let him have it ferociously when he begins to get too near." The animal came within 20 or 30 feet again, and then Lou greeted him with an ear-splitting blast, and he fell back. Again and again the tactics were repeated. Lou tried a thrilling cadenza. It was too much for the brute's nerves. He could not comprehend a girl with such a penetrating voice, and he could not screw up his courage to a closer investigation of the marvel. At last the animal seemed to resolve on a change of procedure. Plunging into the woods, he made an effort to get ahead of the sleigh. Old Jerry was showing signs of exhaustion, but the rector roused him to an extra spurt, and there, just ahead, was the opening of Fillmore's settlement. "Blow, Lou, blow!" shouted the rector, and as the panther made a dash to intercept the sleigh, it found itself in too close proximity to the strange-voiced phenomenon in the pung, and sprang backward with an angry snarl. As Lou's breath failed from her dry lips, the sleigh dashed out into the open. A dog bayed angrily from the nearest farmhouse, and the panther stopped short on the edge of the wood. The rector drove into the farmyard, and old Jerry stopped, shivering as if he would fall between the shafts. After the story had been told, and Jerry had been stabled and rubbed down, the rector resumed his journey with a fresh horse, having no fear that the panther would venture across the cleared lands. 3 of the settlers started out forthwith, and following the tracks in the new snow, succeeded in shooting the beast after a chase of 2 or 3 hours. The adventure supplied the countryside all that winter with a theme for conversation, and about Lou's clarionet there gathered a halo of romance that drew rousing congregations to the parish church, where its music was to be heard every alternate Sunday evening. End of Lou's Clarionet by Charles G.D. Roberts. 20-Foot was an almost deserted mining camp and presented the desolate appearance of such localities, a wide valley honeycombed by old workings and strewn with debris. On one side stretched miles of barren ranges denuded of heavy trees, which had been felled to feed the boilers and timber the underground workings when some of the quartz reefs had been developed after the alluvial gold had been won. These also had petered out. On the other side of the valley were farms, for here rich volcanic soil overlay the Silurian formation. Consequently, there was still a small population in the district, which accounted for the survival of a place of worship, a state school, general store, blacksmith shop, and on a side road a coffee palace. There were only 2 men here now seeking gold, or fossicking as it was called. One was a relic of the 60s, known behind his back as Bushranger Bill, or B.B., who, needless to say, had never followed that occupation, and probably, had he visited the barber, who was also the local blacksmith, more regularly, would never have been so designated. The second fossicker was a man of different stamp. With his family, he lived about a mile above the township at the head of the gully in a comfortable, though small, cottage surrounded by a garden. He had brought his young wife here in the early 70s, just after the volcanic land had been made available for selection, but too late to secure a holding, and here he had remained, digging with varying results. When there was enough rain, he sluiced the old workings, and with the aid of one of the defunct company's dams, could win gold during several months of the year. During the dry spells, he sought old tailings and headings among the abandoned holes, and had them carted to the sluice boxes. It was a precarious existence. I use the word purposely. Still, to him, the life presented a certain fascination, and occasional windfalls lured him on. At the time of which I write, funds were very low. In fact, there were none. It had been a dry winter, the wash dirt put through was poor, and only a portion had been treated, for Hampton had not been able to sluice since August, and now, near the end of December, rain looked as far off as ever. Troubles seldom come singly. The local storekeeper had died recently, and his successor, who decided to run the business on city lines, discouraged long credit. Formerly the family had the necessaries of life assured, for the old storekeeper knew that when the dirt paid, his account had been squared. But this stranger had intimated that unless a payment was forthcoming, the account would be closed. There were now 3 children. The oldest, about 10 years, was named Hope. Some of the schoolgirls, whose parents were in comfortable circumstances, sometimes called her the Forlorn Hope. But this is Christmas time. We will not recall slights nor unkindness now. The other 2 were twins, Grace and Joy. The eldest child was robust and dark, like her father. The twins were fair and resembled the mother, but had short golden curls like spiral springs. They were about 7 years old. It was within a few days of Christmas, and the parents were talking over ways and means. "We must have some extra things for the children," the mother said. She had an anxious but not unhappy expression. Her life for years had been one long struggle to make ends meet. There had always been sufficient food, though of the plainest. sometimes even making a meal of goat's milk and potatoes. At times, for days, their larder knew no butcher's meat when her husband chanced to shoot a rabbit or other game. It was providing clothes and shoes for the children which was the great burden, so that she could send them suitably clad to school. What had gone to her heart most was keeping Hope at times from Sunday school because of her shabby boots. How often had she washed and ironed the children's clothes and mended their much-worn socks after the little ones were asleep. Still, through it all, she was not unhappy. "I've these miniatures of my grandparents in a gold frame. It could be sold for a good sum. Mr. Stoneman would buy it at any time. Leave that at the store for security, and take the letter, too, stating its value. Mr. Douglas does not know us yet." The husband pressed his hands over his face. His voice, though strained, was gentle. "I never expected to bring you to this, Jessie. We should have left this life long ago, but those rich patches in the old workings drew me on. This must end it. When there is water enough and I've cleaned up, I'll take a position in Sydney. I've been very happy here, more so than many of my companions in the old life. I realized this when reading between the lines of their letters," replied the wife. So the miniatures found their way into the Douglas safe, and the good businessman said in his most oily manner, "Of course we respect your word, Mr. Hampton, and looking over the old ledgers I find you have always paid up. Still, you won't object to my getting confirmation of Mr. Stoneman's letter? Business is business, you know." B.B. had visited the Corfe Palace, as the sign announced it, a place which much belied its name, for it did not resemble a palace in any land. It was built of galvanized iron and stringy bark, and coffee was never seen on the premises. There was a tradition that a traveller could procure a cup of tea if he waited long enough. They certainly dispensed hop beer and other liquid refreshment. B.B. was on his way home. It was 2 days before Christmas, and sat down to rest on an old red gum log on the hillside, which had proved too tough to split and too heavy to cart away. Many a campfire had been lighted against it in years gone by. Now the bracken fern provided on one side a soft bed, and some dogwood scrub a shield. As this looked inviting, B.B. sought repose. It was now evening. The lingering rays of the sun streaming over the western hills made even the score-lined gullies and unsightly mullock heaps, with their undergrowth fringes of green, things of beauty. The 3 children were seeking a stray goat, and chanced to sit on the old log to rest. "We're going to have a lovely Christmas," said Joy. "Roast beef and plum pudding and almonds and raisins." B.B. thought he heard voices. He had heard and seen many strange things in the bush after drinking hop beer and other beverages at the Coffee Palace. "I think I'd rather do without them," replied Hope, who was sedate beyond her years. "Perhaps I should not tell you that Mother sold those pictures in the gold frame to buy us clothes and things." "Of course, pictures are very pretty," assented Joy, "but something nice to eat is much better. And they are real raisins, too, like Mother used to have in England, not the sort you put in puddings, but hanging on stalks. And the almonds are a lot nicer than the nuts we get out of jam." "I wonder what Santa Claus will bring us this year," said Grace. "My sock's not very big," remarked Joy. "I'd like to hang up a sugar bag, only it would look greedy." Joy liked a lot, poor child. Oh, you girls, whose every wish has been granted, whose every fancy has been gratified, have you any thought for your poorer sisters, whose lives are so restricted, yet they are thankful for so little, and through it all are good and happy? We hope so. The children ran off chasing each other round the deserted holes and heaps. B.B. sat up and looked after them. Having worked as a hatter for many years, he had contracted the habit of voicing his thoughts. Poor little beggars, and the old man is too proud to take a fiver. B.B. always had gold. He was still watching the children fading in the distance when he struck his hands together. "I've got it! I'll salt his claim. He'll never find out it's Bendigo gold. He doesn't know the game. There is an unwritten law strictly observed among the diggers that no man shall go down the shaft of another without invitation, and to do so at night during the rushes was carrying one's life in one's hand, and B.B. was aware of this. Just after midnight, B.B., dressed in a digger's woolen jumper, which hung down to his knees, a woolen muffler right up to his chin, and a felt hat with the crown pushed up like a cone, appeared about a quarter of a mile from Hampton's home. There was a slight surface depression here, which seemed to indicate a gutter below. Several holes had been sunk along it years before without payable results. B.B., who was an authority, had told Mr. Hampton that he thought the old workings were not worth spending time on. B.B. looked warily round on emerging from the scrub, then cautiously approached, and after a casual glance at the windlass, seized the rope and disappeared. The shaft was only 18 feet deep. A drive ran in for some distance from each end along the gutter. B.B. produced a candle and examined the workings, then drew a tin containing gold dust from his pocket. He paused, again studied the strata and slate underfoot, then tested it with a pick. Now, B.B. was a geologist of a sort. He had not learned the science by correspondence, but by working on most of the alluvial fields in the rush days. The candle burned down almost to the clay as he hesitated. Then he remarked, "False bottom, like the MacIver lead," and returned the gold to his pocket. Taking a length of broken board, he wrote on it with a piece of pipe clay, and drove the sharp end into the floor at the entrance to one of the drives, remarking, "If he gets nothing out of it, I'll salt this show later." Although he could read print, B.B. did not profess to be able to write. In fact, he used to sign for his miner's right with a cross, so the spelling presented difficulties, in particular the word father. Although B.B. believed his nocturnal visit had been unobserved, he was mistaken, for a small white-robed figure had been standing at a window, looking toward the ranges, just made discernible by the rising moon. She noticed someone emerge from the saplings and approach the claim. Hope neither spoke nor moved, but gazed spellbound. Yes, it was Santa Claus. She could see the hoarfrost sparkling all over him. In the driest season at that altitude, there is a heavy dew, so on every minute hair of the digger's clothes and every hair of his whiskers glistened a particle of moisture. Strange he should come a night too soon, and not to the house, she thought, as B.B. disappeared down the shaft. Her eyes never left the spot. Then, after what seemed a long time, the figure reappeared, crossed the flat, and was enveloped in the foliage. But in the broad light of day, Hope was not quite sure that the whole occurrence was not a dream, so being a reserved child, she held her peace. During breakfast the father said, "I'll not go to work today, as there are several things about the place that require seeing to. I'll just bring home the tools and the windlass rope." "Couldn't we get them for you?" inquired Hope. "Oh, be careful of the twins, then, and on your return you can help me with the pudding," said the mother. "I'll go down the shaft and put the tools in the bucket, one at a time, and you two can wind them up. Mind you both don't let go the handles at the same time," cautioned Hope. Many a shaft had she descended, for by swinging the rope from side to side she could reach the footholes made in either side of the shaft with her toes, but not without the aid of the rope. When her eyes became accustomed to the subdued light, she saw the message, "Dig de upper Doxmus." So it was not a dream after all. She was far from an excitable child, but her heart beat faster as she determined to test the value of the message. She quickly ascended and lowered the twins, and then set to work, meanwhile telling her sisters of the visitor. "Is that the way to spell it?" inquired Grace. "We must not make remarks about kind friends," admonished Hope. "Santa Claus is very, very old, and perhaps they spelled that way when he was a boy in the reindeer country." "Of course," agreed Joy. "Did you see the sledge and reindeer?" "No, I think he must have left them on the back track," she replied. "Perhaps he got bogged. Pointer's father did last winter," put in Joy. "Not this weather," said Grace. "Besides, reindeer are very strong. Think what big horns they have." "Well, I expect he just put on their nose bags with moss in them and gave them a rest. I'm sure he is a kind man, for he loves children, and I believe he put some gold here for us to buy things for Mother. Now, you can tell that horrid Mabel that you have seen Santa Claus. She said it was all made up." This from Joy. The slate floor was only a couple of inches in depth. Then came some rubble headings. These Hope put carefully aside. Then came the wash dirt. She understood enough of the art to seek here for the gold, so taking a double handful and spreading it on the notice board, she examined it in the lightest position under the shaft. Joy was the first to cry, "Nugget!" The children had often seen such when the father had been cleaning up the sluice boxes. As they spread and respread the wash, each particle of gold was deposited in a pannikin. Just as the first lot of wash was being scraped into the bucket, a voice called out, "Below there! Are you stealing your father's gold? I'm coming down." "We don't want you! Go away!" shouted Hope. Then, putting the pannikin in the hole she had dug, she whispered to the twins, "Go and sit there and don't move for anything." "I'm not frightened of girls. I'm coming down anyway." The speaker, Master Pierpoint, a boy of about 12, evidently led the simple life, judging by his apparel, which consisted of a striped blue cotton shirt, rather small, cut-down moleskin pants, much too large, and one hayband suspender. "Now, Pointer, if you do, I'll hit you with this board, so there." A body obstructed the light, then two bare legs appeared overhead. Hope made two vigorous blows with the board. There was a yell, "You've broken my little toe," followed by several more yells as the legs rapidly vanished. "You spiteful black-eyed turned-up-nosed native cat! Oh, my toe! I'll get square with you, and you two grinning curly-headed little bandicoots." Pointer's natural history must have received a bump also. On landing, he took the peg out of the windlass, revolved the barrel so that the rope ran out, and fell down the shaft. "Now, you can stop down there until you starve," he yelled down to them, and limped away. "I'll tell Father what he called us," said Grace, who was sensitive. "We can't help our hair being curly. And how are we to get up, Hope? Daddy will come for us, and we must not tell tales unless he asks us about the rope. Boys are all like that. They can't help it." "I'm glad I won't grow up into a boy, aren't you, Grace?" said Joy with fervor. "While we are waiting for Father, we will pick out all the gold we can," said Hope. So they set to work, unmindful of the passage of time. "This is all our gold because we found it," said Hope, "and we will give it all to Mother, just as Father does, except what we keep to buy them presents. Now each choose. Joy first because she is the youngest." It is remarkable the capital Joy made out of such a short period. She never allowed anyone to overlook the fact. "I'll choose a new frying pan because ours has a crack in it, and if I can have 2 goes, a side of bacon. I'll buy a strip of carpet for Mother's bedside and 2 glass dishes to put jam in instead of saucers," said Grace. "I'll get her a piano to play on and teach us, and a silk dress like Mrs. Brown's, only more rustly," chose Hope. "And Daddy, we will buy him a box full of old books. He likes the smelly sort without pictures in them." "I think we should buy him something nice to eat, chocolates and dates. They smell so nice," said Joy. "No," replied Hope with decision. "Men don't care what they have to eat as long as there is enough of it." Joy heaved a sigh. "Glad I'm not going to be a man. Will we be allowed to buy anything for ourselves?" "Certainly not. Nice people don't buy themselves presents." Joy heaved another long-drawn sigh. They were so engrossed in picking out small nuggets from the size of irregular peas to large pins' heads that their father's voice, "Below there," quite startled them. "All's well," replied Hope. "I could not climb up." "Your mother became anxious." "Nice diggers you'll make, letting your rope free," he said, as he descended by the footholes. "We have a Christmas present for Mother," said Hope. "Just feel the weight," as she held a half-filled pannikin toward him. At first he could not see clearly in the subdued light, for the day was cloudy, and most of the particles of gold were covered with clay. Still, a few shone brightly. Then all the blood seemed to rush to his heart, then surge back again and throb at his temples. He leaned across the wall and for a few seconds gasped for breath and could not see clearly. Had the dream of years come true? Had success crowned his efforts at last? Still, he said never a word. Hope, aided by Joy, told the story. "And this is the board, Daddy, with the writing on it." He had not touched the pannikin, but examined the board carefully. There was nothing visible. He produced a candle and matches from a tin box, not a sign of a letter. At first, while the children were speaking, he thought it might have been B.B., but recollected that he could not write. No, it must have been a dream, and that conclusion was adhered to. "I think it was God sent him, because Mother is so good," said Grace, who was devout. "I believe he did," replied the father earnestly. "Now, children, you must hurry home and help your mother." "Oh, do wind us up," requested Joy. It would have been much quicker to have carried each up on his back, but he made a large loop at one end of the rope, climbed up, and attached the other end to the windlass. Then Hope put Joy first, being the younger, into the loop, tucked her clothes under her, and the father slowly wound her up. As he landed each twin, he looked into her eyes and said, "Daddy's girl," and each daddy's girl bored her curly head into his chest as evidence of her affection. Those two were doubly dear to their parents. For some time previously, when that scourge diphtheria swept through the district, it carried their little brother in its train, and for many anxious days the parents were afraid that the twins would follow, and they were so like their mother. With the assistance of the rope, Hope soon appeared. "Now, not a word to your mother until dinner time. Come and call me, and bring the barrow and 2 sugar bags for the wash dirt in the bucket." Here in parentheses we state, although the false bottom ran for some distance along the lead, the rest of the wash was scarcely worth sluicing. B.B. had unconsciously driven in the board just over a rich pocket. Still, there was gold enough to buy a grazing farm on the rich volcanic land, and when the rains came in February and March, with B.B.'s assistance, the accumulated wash was sluiced, and the returns provided funds to purchase stock. B.B. would not accept wages, but the lease of the dam was transferred to him, and he had the use of the races and sluice boxes. But he would pay rent for the cottage, so every fortnight he called at the farm and placed 2 shillings on the kitchen table. The last time I heard from there, the family were living in comfort, and B.B., well, he was the same old B.B. Now we must return. There was one member of this family who never forgot that Christmas morning, who laid and watched the daylight break over the eastern mountains and listened to the magpies welcoming the coming day. Gradually the sun appeared, his shading beams turning every dewdrop on leaf and fern into a matchless gem. Even the unsightly mullock heaps shared in the splendor, and reflected hues of purple and of gold, as if kind nature, forgiving man's wantonness, were endeavoring to cover transgressions with love. And as the children, in tune with the angelic choir on this glad Christmas morning, chanted, "Hark the herald angels sing, glad tidings to our newborn King," it found an echo in each grateful heart, but with a sweeter melody in the mother place as she realized that the struggle to provide for her little brood was at an end. And I trust the reader and the writer will hear that same glad song, and each heart will echo the message, "On earth, peace, goodwill to men." End of Santa Claus's Message, A Christmas Story, by E. Franklin Tregaskis. It was the night before Christmas, snow was falling without, and the wind dashed the cold flakes in eddying whirls into the faces of those wayfarers whom business or pleasure kept out thus late. They drew their warm garments more closely about them and hurried onward, little heeding the pelting of the storm, while the vision of a cheerful hearth and a merry family circle danced before their eyes and warmed their hearts. Merry St. Nicholas, too, the patron saint of children, was abroad. It was a busy night with him. Thousands of parcels must be made up and showered down as many chimneys into expectant stockings before the morrow's dawn. So he gives the rein to his coursers and speeds swiftly along, through forest and brake, through deep drifting snow, over river and lake, over hill, over dale, where the keen northern blast, with fierce angry moaning, drives fearfully past. In a large and pleasant room sat little Bertha, gazing thoughtfully into the fire. The fire crackled and burnt, and shadows cast by its flickering light danced on the wall. But little Bertha's thoughts were far away, and she heeded them not. For many weeks she had been looking forward to this very night, and now she was trying to conjecture what gifts good St. Nicholas had in store for her. At length she grew weary of conjecture and took a lamp from the table and went upstairs to bed. It was a neat little chamber, and the counterpane on Bertha's bed rivaled in whiteness the falling snow without. Bertha looked out of the window, against the panes of which the snow was beating noisily. "Oh, it is a cold night," thought she. "St. Nicholas will have a hard time of it. What if he should not come at all?" Bertha's apprehensions were soon dispelled, for as she looked out, the sound of silvery bells came nearer and nearer, till at length it paused under her window, and a moment afterwards was heard in an opposite direction. Bertha rubbed her eyes and strove to distinguish the sleigh from which these sounds proceeded, but she could distinguish nothing. "Can it be St. Nicholas?" thought she. Even as she spoke, mingling with the sound of the retreating bells, she thought she could distinguish the words of a song. She listened attentively, and these were the words which the wind bore to her. "The path I have chosen is covered with snow, the streams are all frozen, yet onward I go. I glide o'er the mountain and skim o'er the lea. I pass by the fountain, yet no eye can see. My form or my shadow on snowdrift or mound, on hilltop or meadow or frost-spangled ground. While sleigh bells are ringing upon the highway and glad parties singing, so thoughtless and gay, I pass through and over each hamlet and hall, ere mortals discover who gave them a call. I pause but to count o'er the gifts for each one, and then quickly mount o'er the stile. I am gone." That must certainly be Santa Claus, thought Bertha, so she carefully hung up her stockings before the fire and went to bed. She soon became tired of waiting for St. Nicholas to come, and in a few minutes she was asleep. But the thoughts of Christmas had taken fast hold of her mind, and as she slept, shaped themselves into the following dream. She thought that as she was lying awake in her chamber, there appeared suddenly before her 3 figures clad in white. Slowly they advanced, hand in hand, until they stood before her bedside. Then, with united voices, they chanted the following lines. "Maiden, from the fields of air, we have winged our rapid flight, bringing gifts both rich and rare on this frosty Christmas night. Guard them ever, they will be of exceeding worth to thee." They ceased, and Bertha, in great astonishment, inquired, "What? Are you St. Nicholas?" Or, she added, recollecting herself, "Perhaps you are his sisters." The visitors resumed their chant. "Maiden, know, thy Christmas saint beareth gifts of mortal taint. At the touch of sure decay, they will vanish quite away. Those we bear are not of earth, theirs has been a higher birth." The visitors ceased, and one of their number coming forward commenced anew. "I am Faith. To thee I bear childlike trust and confidence in the ever-watchful care of our Father's providence. Maiden, one of sisters 3, this the gift I bear to thee." The second came forward and repeated, I am hope. When darksome clouds gather round thy earthly way, and misfortune's shadowy veil intercepts the light of day, I will come on wings of light. Clouds and mist shall straightway fly, and reveal the golden gates of a happier home on high. Maiden, one of sisters three, this the gift I bear to thee. Smiling graciously on the wondering Bertha, Hope drew back and gave place to her sister, who commenced as follows. I am Charity. Let me ever on thy steps attend, and as long as life shall last, be thy counselor and friend. In thy bosom I would sow seeds of gentleness and love, and a resident of earth fit thee for a home above. Maiden and last of sisters three, this the gift I bear to thee. Again the sisters joined hands, and with united voices chanted as at first, Maiden, from the fields of air we have winged our rapid flight, bringing gifts both rich and rare on this frosty Christmas night. Faith and hope and charity, earthly maiden, sisters three, these the gifts we bear to thee. Their voices died away, and they were gone. Bertha opened her eyes, and lo, it was all a vision that had come to her on this Christmas night. The morning sun was shining brightly through the window panes. Noisily over the frozen snow dashed the sleighs, and their bells rang a merry peal in honor of Christmas Day. Bertha glanced at the well-filled stockings that hung in front of the fire, and then she knew that St. Nicholas had been there with his budget of gifts, and the words sung by the sisters came into her mind. Maiden, know, thy Christmas saint beareth gifts of mortal taint. Those we bear are not of earth, theirs has been a higher birth. I will not forget the gifts of the good sisters, she murmured softly. Doubtless it is my heavenly Father who has sent them to me. So it was that little Bertha, attended by the three sisters, walked peacefully and happily through life. The ways of God's providence, so dark and mysterious to many, became plain and clear to her, for she saw with the eye of faith. Clouds sometimes gathered around her path, but hope waved her wand, and they were at once dispelled. Jealousy and envy and angry thoughts disturbed her not, for her heart was filled with the heavenly spirit of charity. Would that we all might be blessed with Bertha's Christmas Vision. End of Bertha's Christmas Vision by Horatio Alger, Jr. Heavily, heavily fell the snow, covering the dark brown earth, already hardened by the frost, with a pure white covering. As the rain falls alike upon the just and upon the unjust, so too the snow, God's kindred messenger, knows no distinction of persons, visiting all alike, forgetting none, and passing by none. In one of the principal streets of New York stood a boy of some 12 years. His clothing was poor and too scanty to afford a sufficient protection against the inclemency of the season. Through the visor of his cap, which had become detached in the middle, having a connection only at the two extremities, might be seen his rich brown hair. Notwithstanding the drawback of his coarse and ill-fitting attire, it was evident that he possessed a more than ordinary share of boyish beauty. But just at present his brow is overcast with a shade of anxiety, and his frame trembles with the cold from which he is so insufficiently shielded. It is a handsome street, that in which he is standing. On either side he beholds the residences of those on whom fortune has showered her favors. Bright lights gleam from the parlor windows, and shouts of mirth and laughter ring out upon the night. All is joy and brightness and festivity within these palace homes. The snowflakes fall idly against the window panes. They cannot chill the hearts within, nor place a bar upon their enjoyment, for this is Christmas Eve, long awaited, at length arrived. Christmas Eve, around which so many youthful anticipations cluster, has enjoyments peculiarly its own, over which the elements, however boisterous, have no control. Yet to some, Christmas Eve brings more sorrow than enjoyment, serving only to heighten the contrast between present poverty and discomfort and past affluence. But all this time we have left our little hero shivering in the street. Cold and uncomfortable as he was, as well as anxious in mind, for he had lost his way and knew not how to find it again, he could not help forgetting his situation for the time in witnessing the scene which met his eye, as for a moment he stood in front of a handsome residence on the south side of the street. The curtains were drawn aside, so that by supporting himself on the railing he had an unobstructed view of the scene within. It was a spacious parlor, furnished in a style elegant but not ostentatious. In the center of the apartment was a Christmas tree, brilliant with tapers, which were gleaming from every branch and twig. Gifts of various kinds were hung upon the tree, around which were gathered a group of 3 children, respectively of 8, 6, and 4 years. The eldest was a winsome fairy with sparkling eyes and dancing feet. The others were boys who were making the most of this rare opportunity of sitting up after 9 o'clock. At a little distance stood Mr. Dinsmore and his wife, gazing with unalloyed enjoyment at the happiness of their children. While Lizzie was indulging in expressions of delight at the superb wax doll which St. Nicholas had so generously provided, her attention was for a moment drawn to the window, through which she distinctly saw the figure of our hero, who, as we have said, had in his eagerness raised himself upon the railing outside in order to obtain a better view. She uttered an exclamation of surprise. "Why, Mother, there's a boy looking in at the window. Just look at him." Mrs. Dinsmore looked in the direction indicated, and saw the little boy, without his perceiving that attention had been drawn towards him. "Some poor boy," she remarked to her husband in a compassionate tone, "who loses for a moment the sensation of his own discomfort in witnessing our happiness. See how eagerly he looks at the tree, which no doubt appears like something marvelous to him." "Why can't we let him in?" asked Lizzie eagerly. "He must be very cold out there, with the snowflakes falling upon him. Perhaps he would like to have a nearer view of our tree." "Very well and kindly thought of, my little girl," said Mr. Dinsmore, placing his hand for a moment upon her clustering locks. "I will follow your suggestion, but I must do it carefully, or he may be frightened and run away before he knows what are our intentions." So speaking, Mr. Dinsmore moved cautiously to the front door and opened it suddenly. The boy, startled by the sound, turned toward Mr. Dinsmore with a frightened air, as if fearing that he would be suspected of some improper motive. "Indeed, sir," said he earnestly, "I didn't mean any harm, but it looked so bright and cheerful inside that I couldn't help looking in." "You have done nothing wrong, my boy," said Mr. Dinsmore kindly, "but you must be cold here. Come in, and you will have a chance to see more comfortably than you do now." The boy looked a little doubtful, for to him, neglected as he had been by the rich and prosperous all his life, it was very difficult to imagine that he was actually invited to enter the imposing mansion before him as a guest. Perhaps Mr. Dinsmore divined his doubts, for he continued, "Come, you must not refuse the invitation. There are some little people inside who would be very disappointed if you should, since it was they who commissioned me to invite you." "I am sure, sir, I am very much obliged both to them and to you," said the boy gratefully, advancing towards Mr. Dinsmore, of whom he had lost whatever little distrust he had at first felt. A moment afterwards, and the boy stepped within the spacious parlor. To him, whose home offered no attractions and few comforts, the scene spread before him might well seem a scene of enchantment. "Lizzie," said Mr. Dinsmore, "come forward and welcome your guest. I would introduce him to you, but unluckily I do not know his name." "My name is Willie Grant," was the boy's reply. "Then, Willie Grant, this is Miss Lizzie Dinsmore, who is, I am sure, glad to see you, since it was at her request that I invited you to enter." Willie raised his eyes timidly and bent them for a moment on the singularly beautiful child, who had come forward and frankly placed her hand in his. There is something irresistible in the witchery of beauty, and Willie felt a warm glow crimsoning his cheeks, as for a moment, forgetful of everything else, he bent his eyes earnestly upon Lizzie. Then another feeling came over him, and with a look of shame at his scanty and ill-fitting garments, he dropped her hand and involuntarily shrank back, as if seeking to screen them from sight. Perceiving the movement and guessing its cause, Mr. Dinsmore, with a view to dissipate these feelings, led forward Harry and Charlie, the younger boys, and told them to make acquaintance with Willie. With loud shouts of delight, they displayed the various gifts which St. Nicholas had brought them, and challenged his admiration. Everything was new to Willie. His childhood had not been smiled upon by fortune, and the costly toys which the boys exhibited elicited quite as much admiration as they could desire. Occupied in this way, his constraint gradually wore off to such a degree that he assisted Charlie and Harry in trying their new toys. Soon, however, the recollection that it was growing late and that he had yet to find his way home came to him, and taking his old hat, he said to Mr. Dinsmore in an embarrassed manner, "My mother will be expecting me home, and I should already have been there, but that I lost my way and happened to look in at your window, and you were so kind as to let me come in." "Where does your mother live, my little fellow?" asked Mr. Dinsmore. "On Street." "Oh, that is not far off. I will myself show you the way, if you will remain a few minutes longer." Mr. Dinsmore rang the bell and ordered a plate of cake and apples, as he conjectured they would not be unacceptable to his little visitor. Meanwhile, Lizzie crept to her mother's side and whispered, "Willie is poor, isn't he?" "Yes. What makes you ask?" "I thought he must be, because his clothes look so thin and patched. Don't you think he would like a Christmas present, Mother?" "Yes, my darling. Have you anything to give him?" "I thought, Mother, perhaps you would let me give him my $5 gold piece. I think that would be better than any playthings. May I give it?" "Oh, yes, my child, if you are really willing. But are you quite sure that you would not regret it afterwards?" "Yes, Mother." And Lizzie ran lightly to the little box where she kept her treasure, quickly brought it forth, and placed it in Willie's hand. "This is your Christmas present," said she gaily. Willie looked surprised. "Do you mean it for me?" he asked in a half-bewildered tone. "Yes, if you like it." "Oh, I thank you very much for your kindness," said Willie earnestly, "and I will always remember it." There was something in the boy's earnest tone which Lizzie felt was an ample recompense for the little sacrifice she had made. Mr. Dinsmore fulfilled his promise, and walked with Willie as far as the street in which he lived, when, feeling sure that he could no longer mistake his way, he left him. Mr. Dinsmore, whom we have introduced to our readers, was a prosperous merchant, and counted his wealth by hundreds of thousands. Fortunately, his disposition was liberal, and he made the poor sharers with him in the gifts which fortune had so liberally showered upon him. Notwithstanding the good use which he made of his wealth, he was fated to experience reverses, resulting not from his own mismanagement, but from a general commercial panic, which all at once involved in ruin many whose fortunes were large, and whose credit was long established. In a word, Mr. Dinsmore failed. 11 years had rolled by since the Christmas night in which our story opens. Lizzie had not belied the promise of her girlhood, but had developed into a radiantly beautiful girl. Already her hand had been sought in marriage, but as yet she had seen no one on whom she could look with that affection without which marriage would be a mockery. Charlie and Harry, too, 11 years had changed them not a little. The boys of 4 and 6 had become fine, manly youths of 15 and 17. The eldest had entered college. Harry, however, who was by no means studious, had entered his father's counting-room. That was a sorrowful night on which Mr. Dinsmore made known to his afflicted wife the bankruptcy which was inevitable. Still sadder, if possible, was the sale which it enforced of the house which they had so long occupied, the furniture which had become endeared to them by memory and association, and the harsh interruption which loss of fortune put to all their treasured schemes. "My poor boy," said Mrs. Dinsmore sorrowfully, as she placed her hand caressingly on the brown locks of Charlie, the eldest of the two boys, "it will be a hard sacrifice for you to leave the studies to which you are so much attached, and enter a store, as you will be obliged to do." "Oh, I'd not thought of that," murmured Charlie. "It will indeed be a sacrifice. But, Mother, I would not care for that, if you could only be spared the trials to which you will be exposed from poverty." "Thank you for your consideration, my child, but do not fear that I shall not accommodate myself to it. It is a heavy trial, but we must try to think that it will ultimately eventuate in our good." At the auction of Mr. Dinsmore's house and furniture, the whole property, without exception, was knocked off to a young man who seemed apparently of 22 or 3 years of age. He was able to secure it at a price much beneath its real value, for times were hard and money scarce, so that he had but few competitors. Mr. Dinsmore did not hear his name, and the pressure of sad thoughts prevented his making the inquiry. Possession was to be given in 1 week. Meanwhile, Mr. Dinsmore sought out a small house in an obscure part of the town, which, in point of elegance and convenience, formed a complete contrast to the one he had formerly occupied. He felt, however, that it would be all his scanty salary as clerk, for he had secured a situation in that capacity, would enable him to afford. Lizzie looked with a rueful face at the piano as a dear friend from whom she must henceforth be separated, it being quite too costly a piece of furniture to be retained in their reduced circumstances. Her proficiency in music, for which she had a great taste, made her regret it doubly, since she might with it have added to the resources of the family by giving music lessons. On the last evening in which they were to remain in the old house, their sad thoughts were broken in upon by a ring at the bell. "Can they not even leave us to enjoy the last evening in quiet?" said Charles, half petulantly. Immediately afterwards there entered a young man, in whom Mr. Dinsmore recognized the purchaser of the house. "I need not bid you welcome," said he, smiling faintly, "since you have a better right here now than I myself. Had I been told 3 months since that this would be, I would not have believed it, but we cannot always foresee. I shall be prepared to leave tomorrow." "I shall be better satisfied if you will remain," said the young man, bowing. "What do you mean?" "Simply that, as this house and furniture are now mine, to do with as I like, I choose to restore you the latter, and offer you the use of the former, rent-free, as long as you choose to occupy it." "Who, then, are you," asked Mr. Dinsmore, in increasing surprise, "who can be so kind to utter strangers, with no claim upon you?" "You are mistaken. You have a claim upon me. Shall I tell you what it is? 11 years ago tomorrow, for tomorrow is Christmas Day, a poor boy who had known none of the luxuries and but few of the comforts of life stood in this street. His mind was ill at ease, for he had lost his way, but as he walked on he beheld a blaze of light issuing from a window, from your window, and aroused by curiosity he looked in. Around a Christmas tree, brilliant with light, a happy group were assembled. As he stood gazing in, he heard the front door open, and a gentleman came out and kindly invited him to enter. He did so, and the words of kindness and the Christmas gift with which he departed have not yet left his remembrance. 7 years passed, and the boy's fortune changed. An uncle, long supposed to be dead, found him out, and when he actually died, left him the heir of a large amount of wealth. Need I say that I am that boy, and that my name is Willie Grant? The reader's imagination can easily supply the rest. Provided with capital by his young friend, Mr. Dinsmore again embarked in business, and this time nothing occurred to check his prosperity. Charlie did not leave college, nor did Lizzie lose her piano. She gained a husband, however, and had no reason to regret the train of events which issued from her Christmas gift. End of The Christmas Gift by Horatio Alger, Jr. As far as man could suppose, every element that goes to make up happiness was united to bless Mr. and Mrs. Birdwood. He was in easy circumstances, that is to say, he had earned enough money not to be obliged to work any longer, and had his own little house and could keep a slavey. He was inoffensive in his pursuits, being fond of flowers, especially of roses, which he grafted. And what harm can there be in a man who loves gardening? Next to marrying a curate, a woman has a good certainty of her husband turning out amiable and orderly if he grafts roses. Then again, he was in the prime of life, by no means bad-looking, amiable, and placid. You could not study his face and not see that he was good-natured. On the other hand, Mrs. Birdwood was comely, a lively woman, neat in shape, under 30, and of a florid complexion, which ought to suit a man addicted to flowers. She had made a good match, said her friends, for she was one of 14, and had come penniless to his arms. She had been Eliza Gubbins, and had dropped the Gubbins at the altar. No one could deny that she was the gainer when she acquired a name that carried with it a suggestion of piping and tooting and whistling and jug-jugging and cooing of all kinds of songbirds. But there is a fly in every cup, a thorn to every rose, some bone in every joint you get from the butcher, a cloud in every sky. Mr. Birdwood was of an over-placid and too easy-going nature to satisfy Mrs. Birdwood, who was